We'll get rolling here in a few minutes. If you would, go ahead and bring up the room word sample project that we started last week. All right, so welcome back, everybody. So we covered the theory portion of live data, talking about live data view model and the repository pattern yesterday. So what we want to start in now today is continuing on with that 10.1a lab. And we're going to integrate those parts that we talked about yesterday. So this is going to put what we do today should put us at the end of 10.1a. That's the hope. Plan to finish all of 10.1a today, and then you'll be able to work on 10.1b on your own. Tomorrow I want to plan is to go over the hands-on test and integrate live data view model, integrate that there and kind of talk about how does that work with say having volley and having network resources versus a database. So integrating all those kind of pieces with the hands-on test project that we created. So we'll do that tomorrow, and then on Friday we'll finish up any of the stuff that we didn't get to. Maybe if we didn't finish up everything on Thursday, we'll finish that up on Friday, and then you'll be working on your 10.1 B labs as well as your final project. And specifically, your proposal, remember, is due, I think, the end of this week. But you should also be spending some time on your final project integrating the stuff that we've talked about here, especially in Chapter 10. Because I do expect you to have a database for your final project. I do expect you to have some network resources. So that's kind of where we stand. I did go look through the due dates on Inside Rankin and Perusal. I did see that a few of them were out of sync. A few of them had slipped. I think I had originally put them in a little bit optimistically. So I've updated all of those. I think there were a few things that were set to, say, the April 10th and April 17th. That really should have been set to the 22nd. So I've moved a lot of things out to the 22nd, both on Inside Rankin and Perusal. So check that out. If you haven't done those assignments, just make sure that you do get them done. But the due dates have been pushed back on there because I think originally they were not really realistic with where we were at with everything that needed to happen with Chapter 10 especially. So that's where we stand. To give you kind of an overview of what we're going to do today, we kind of skipped around in the tasks when we originally built this application because I was trying to just pull out the room database pieces and do those. So now we're also going to be skipping around a little bit to finish up the parts that we didn't touch when we went through this previously. So we'll go through task 4, which is integrating the live data. We'll then look at extracting some stuff out of the main activity into an application class because we haven't done that yet. Then we'll look at adding in a repository, adding in a view model, and then finally we'll go to task 11 where we're going to connect that view model to the UI. So that's what we're going to hit today, and that should be everything that's remaining from this lab. Okay, so let's start at task 4. So task 4, we're kind of going to jump up here and we're going to work with this live data. This live data is typically integrated into a view model, but we're going to start kind of without some of those other components in place. So we'll put the live data in, and then we'll start kind of gradually adding some of these additional pieces to it. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is I want to integrate that live data. I need to go to my Word DEO interface. Okay. So right now, this is just returning a list of words. So what this means is because we're doing this, it does mean that you have to call getAllWords on a background thread in order to be able to call it at all, meaning you have to use an async task or some sort of other background thread to be able to even call this. But it also means that you don't get notified of changes when when the data is changed. So what we want to do is make this return a live data object so we can watch for changes, and so that Room can manage those background threads more or less on its own. So in here, I'm just going to do a very simple change to this class, this interface. So this is going to return a live data list word. That's it. That's all we're going to change to this class. Okay. Now that's going to break our code because the rest of our application isn't really expecting that yet. So we do have to make some changes on top of that and then integrate that with the rest of our application. Okay. So that's the first change. Is we changed this to return live data. So that will make then make Room run this on a background thread for us. And we just need to observe this object for changes to it. Okay, so that's the first bit there. Now I'm going to go back to main activity now that I've done that. And I need to start making changes here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this member variable that we have here from just storing a list of words to storing a live data words. Okay, so that's going to store a reference to the current live data object. Okay, that's step one. Now down here in onCreate, I do need to change a few things there. So the first of which is I need to remove that here. I'm going to pass in, well, I need to remove that line of code where I'm creating the array list. Instead here, I'm going to say m words is equal to m database dot get word do dot get all words. Okay, so that's going to initialize that live data object, and then when we create our adapter, it would really like that list. Okay, so I do need to extract it, so I'm going to do word list dot get value. Okay, so that's going to grab whatever current value is in live data, pass it on to our adapter. Initially, when this runs, that means that this is going to be null. Okay, that's going to be null the first time this runs. At later point, once the data actually gets loaded from the database, then that value in there will actually contain the list of rows. So this is the first thing we need to change for the onCreate. Okay. The next piece that we need to change is to actually remove this task here. So rather than using an async task to retrieve the words, I'm going to set up an observer for the live data object. So I'm going to comment out that line. I'm going to do mwords dot observe, and here I want this to be this. This is the owner, and I need a new observer of type that receives a list word. Okay, so this observer is going to get called when there is a new list. Inside there, it's fairly simple to implement that. I'm just going to say adapter dot set items words. So anytime we hear that there is a new list of words, all I have to do is tell the adapter about that new list, and that will go ahead and take care of doing the notify adapter has changed. If we look at set items, we're just saving that value and then calling notify data set change. So that will tell the recycler view. This line will tell the recycler view that it needs to update. So that's basically it. So that's the start there. Now I need to go down to both of my tasks and make a change. So the first task, this get all words task, I'm actually just going to completely comment out, because using this live data, I won't actually need it anymore. Okay, so I won't need that task because I'm using the live data. Also, on the insert word task, once I inserted the word, I was going back and updating that list to add it there. I don't need to do that anymore because the observer will take care of it. So this else case here, I no longer need. So I'm going to remove that as well. So I'm just going to insert the word. That's going to go ahead and trigger an event to the observer, and it will then know that there is a new word. So just removing that bit of code here. Okay, so we can see the data is already loaded. It actually came in pretty quickly. If I hit plus, let's try to add a new word and save. We'll see it's added in there. If I try to add maybe alligator and hit save, we'll see it's actually putting it up at the top now as well. Because as part of the query that we gave it up here, we told it to order it. So now when we've moved over to live data, it automatically takes care of things like that, where it will go ahead and rerun the query and give it back to us in the correct order. Okay. Any questions there about live data? That should be, you can see it's fairly simple to make that change. So that's task 4. The next thing I wanted to do was add in an application object. The main reason for that, yours is crashing. I'd have to see the error, Alex, to see why yours is crashing. So the main reason we want to extract some of this logic to the application object is right now we're saying build database, which means we're saying create the database every time this activity is opened, which means that we're going to try and repopulate or update the schema every time that this activity opens. We really want to do that we want to create the database object once when the application starts. So I need to kind of move that logic up into the application. That's interesting, Alex. Do you have the actual stack trace for that? Null object reference. So it might be, are you sure you're doing this line after you get the database object? It says attempting to evoke get word DO on a null object. So to me, that would indicate that your database object is currently null. So my best guess would be that you maybe have this line before line 45, Alex. Because if you have that in the reverse order, then the database is definitely going to be null. So that would explain it. Okay. All right. So if I go to here, okay, so we want to create that adapter class. Sorry, not the adapter class, the application class. So I'm going to call that word app. It's the name of my application class. Yep. Add extends application. We're going to implement the onCreate method. Okay, and then we need to register this class in the manifest. So I'm going to go do that right now. I'll go back to the manifest. Application name, Android name is .WordApp. Okay, so now Android knows about our application class, which is great. And now I need to start moving some of the things that we have right now in our activity over to our application class, namely the creation of the database object. So in here, rather than creating it here, build database, I'm going to move that over here. So we're going to have a variable, a member variable for the database object. Inside the onCreate here, I'm going to call mDatabase is equal to word database dot build database. I want to add a getter. This needs to be this, because this is the application. And then I need a getter for the database object. So public word database get database. And that's just going to return mDatabase. Okay, so that means that this database object only ever gets created once, rather than being created every time main activity starts, or every time we get a new main activity. So that'll help. So just by moving that there, I need to then go back to here. I'm going to add a reference to the application object, private word app, app. Okay, and then I'm going to go down here. Mapp is equal to get application. I need to cast that to word app. Okay, cool. And then here's the big line of code that I want to make sure I change. So rather than building the database object here, I'm going to get it from the application. So I'm going to change this to mapp.getDatabase. Okay, so this will ensure that there's only one database object in my application. I'm going to have that be owned by the application rather than my individual activities owning that database. Now, in a minute, when we add the repository, I'm actually going to even remove it further than that. So the repository will will have a reference to the database, but the activity won't even have a reference to it. Okay, so this is moving that out into the application side. Okay, so let's give that a try. One thing that this is going to do is if I now leave the application and come back, I'm going to see that my data is still there. So right now I'm in here. I'm going to add a new word, alligator. Save. Okay, so I've got alligator in there. I'm going to hit the little square button here and close all the other applications that I have open, which I have a few. Okay, so now let's go back in. Now I don't want to restart it using this button. If I use the run button from the from Android Studio, that's going to go ahead and reinstall the app, which is going to mean I'm going to lose that state that I'm interested in looking at. So I do need to rerun it from here to see that. Okay, and we'll fix that in a second, so it's the same both ways. I need to find out which one this is. That's the one I want. And I should uninstall that one. Yeah, uninstall the other example. Okay, so room words. There we go. Now, oh, well, I guess it didn't. So that did not work the way I wanted. All right, well, let's go to the word database then. And I'm going to change this to be on create. Okay. There we go. Let's add alligator. Hit save. I'm going to leave the app. and come back to it this time, and it should still have there. Okay, so now it's preserving the values that I saved. And the main thing I did there is just switch this to be listening for on create in the word database object. Okay. So that's that. Just checking. Does everybody have that transitioned over to the application object now? So going back to my agenda, so we've introduced live data, we've moved stuff over to the application object, and the next change I want to do is task 6, which is where we introduce that repository. Okay, so in here I'm going to create a new class that's going to be called Word Repository. Okay. There is Word Repository. Inside of there, I need to add a few variables. So private Word DAO, Word DAO. I guess I could also have this reference the database object would be the other way to do that, and maybe that's a little bit better. Let me just reference the database object here instead of the DAO. So mDatabase. Okay, and then I also want to have a reference to the live data object. Live data all words. The upside of having the database object here instead of the DAO is that I don't have to create a field for all the DAOs that I have, because in reality you're going to have a DAO for every table that you have. So if you have, say, 20 tables, that's one variable rather than 20 variables. So that at least saves me a little bit of code writing it that way. I need to add a constructor here, public Word repository. It's going to be application. I need the application object, and I also would like the database object to come in here. Okay, so those are my parameters to the constructor, and then I'm going to say mDatabase is equal to db. I probably want to save the application as well. So private Word app mapp is equal to an app, and I need to be specific about that. Okay, so Word app, Word database, and then I need my live data. So all words is equal to db dot get word DAO dot get all words. So one thing to be wary of, by doing this here, I am saying that I want to keep the list of words up to date and keep it around. So as soon as the word repository gets created, that actually means that that's going to issue the select query because of that line there. So just be forewarned with that. That does mean that we're now keeping that data in memory. So you may not want to do that for all of your tables in your application. You're only going to want to do that with the primary tables that the user's basically always seeing all the data for. So for instance, with the NPR app, the news stories, I would keep the articles in memory. If you were dealing with, say, an e-commerce store, I would keep your products maybe in memory if that's being shown in the a main recycler view, but I might not keep all the user data. I might only keep the data that's really needs to be up to date. So just that's one thing to be forewarned. This does mean that you're keeping the entire table, the entire table's data in memory. So if that's not what you want, then you may want to move that further down and have that in the repository and not necessarily store it as a variable here. But I'm going to do that here. Okay, so I need a few getters. So a few methods. Public live data list word. That's going to be get all words. And this is going to return all words. So the goal of this repository class is to kind of add another level of separation between the activity and the data storage mechanisms. So if the data storage mechanisms need to change or need to dynamically switch from one thing to another, the activity isn't really aware of that. It just knows that it connects to the repository instead of connecting to the database directly. So that's why we need to provide the functionality that was originally provided basically by Word DEO. So in here, we're going to have a method to get all words, but we also need to provide access to the method to insert a word. So in here, I'm going to say public void insert word. It's going to take a word object. So we can insert that. And then I need to have that run on a background thread. My goal here is to not have the front end know about what's happening here on the back end, not know about the background threads. So all that code I've got right now in main activity that's running it through an async task, basically I'm going to move that back here into the repository. Okay, so in the repository I want to spin up a thread, but I need to create that async task to do that first. Okay, so here I'm going to create a new async task, private class insert word task, and this extends async task. It needs to take in a word, but it's not going to have any progress event, progress item, or a result. Both of those should be void. So word void void. Okay, I'm going to hit Alt Enter here. That's going to bring in the import. I'm going to hit Alt Enter again to implement those methods. So I need to implement the do and background method. So we can see here that it needs to take a array of words. We're going to call that params. Okay, so we know the way we're going to set this up is it's only going to be inserting one word at a time. Okay, so that word that it's actually going to insert, I'm just going to pull that off as the first parameter. So param 0, that's the word we're going to insert. And then in here, I need to tell it to actually insert that word. So mDatabase dot get word DO dot insert word. Okay. Now we'll remember from the example that we did previously, I may need to do some sort of exception handling with that, because this could technically fail, right? So this could, if I try to insert the same word twice, this is actually going to throw an exception. So I do want to put a try-catch around this to deal with those exceptions. So if anything does go wrong, I do need to log that. Ideally, I'd also want to be able to show that in some sort of toast message. But because of how things work out, I can't really show it here. You'll remember that I can't display a toast from the background thread. So I had to do that logic in the onPost execute. Well, I'm going to move this a little bit. I'm going to move these things around a little bit, and use maybe a broadcast to deal with that instead here, because I want to disconnect the Word repository entirely from the UI. Okay, which also means disconnecting it from things like toasts. So in the catch, I want to catch any type of exception. And here I'd like to log it. So I again need a log tag constant. So private static final string. This is going to be called log tag. And that is equal to word repository dot class dot get simple name. Okay, so that's my log tag. So it's going to be logged as word repository. Go down here, log.e, failed to insert word, and pass in the exception. Okay, so that's at least going to log the exception. The user won't be able to see that exception yet, so I may need to come back here and fix that. We'll notice that it's complaining that there's no return down here. So I do need to add a quick return null. Fix me show toast with error message. So that's one thing I'm going to need to come back and correct, is some way to show it to the user about what went wrong. But at least I can log it to the console here. Okay. Now we can, once we've got this task, I can now implement this method here. So I'm going to say new insert word task dot execute, and we're going to pass in that word that the user wants to add. Okay, so that's the start of my repository. Okay, so it can return the list of words, and it can insert a word. Those are the only two operations that the user can do from the front end. When we get to the point where I think 10.1b will ask you to give the user a way to delete data, so that will need to then be integrated into this repository. But this is all the functionality that we have right now that's kind of going between the back end and the front end. Okay, so now that we've got this word repository, we need to actually create it, and then we need to set the UI up to use it. So now that I created the word repository, I'm going to go to Word app, and we're going to start actually use that. Okay, so we can see that the word repository constructor takes an application object, takes a database object. So I'm going to add that in here. Private word repository. Repository. So the application is going to own that. And here I'm going to say mRepository is equal to new word repository. And I need to pass in this as the application, and then the database as the second parameter. Okay, so that's created. And now I actually want to remove this getter. I don't want to give direct access to my database object. That I want to be only through the repository. So I'm going to remove that getter. I'm going to add a new getter, public word repository. We're going to call this get repository. and this is just going to return the M repository. So my goal is to change the main activity such that it's using this repository, which uses the database indirectly, rather than integrating with the database directly, which is what it's currently doing. Okay, so we're going to introduce that repository there. Okay, so this is going to ensure that the repository only gets created once, same way that this ensured that the database only gets created once. Okay, so going back to main activity now, we now have this reference to the database, which I don't have anymore, which I'm not going to use anymore. So I'm going to change this to Word repository instead of Word database. I'm going to rename this variable to M repository. M repository. Change this line of code down here as well. So get the repository instead. And here I'm going to pull it from the repository instead. So mRepository.get all words. Okay. So I've changed that instance variable to be a repository instead of a database. I've changed both of these lines of code, lines 47 and 48, to use the repository instead of using the database and the DAOs. So it doesn't have direct reference to either of those things anymore. It still has access to the live data object, but it doesn't know where that live data object came from, which means that it could potentially, for all it's concerned, it could come from the internet, could come from some sort of network resource, or it could come from a database, or it could come from a file. It really doesn't know where the actual data is stored. Whereas when it was connecting directly to the database object, it did have some knowledge of that effectively. Okay. Any questions on those changes? Any issues so far? You're probably still going to have an error with your code, but does everybody have those changes now in place? Cool. All right, so we've integrated the repository. I do need to go down to here. So we had this insert word task. I'm also going to comment this async task out. Because we're not going to use either this insert, this async task, insert word task, or the get all words task anymore. Okay. Now what that does mean is I also need to go to where it was being used, which was here in the on activity result. Remember, that's where we respond to when the actual word comes back from the new word activity. I need to change that. Instead of running a task, that's going to say m repository dot insert word. I do need to pass that in as a word object. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do instead. So the repository is now dealing with running that in a background thread. So the UI has no knowledge that that's happening. It just says, okay, repository, go insert the word, do what you need. But notice that it's not listening for or waiting for any sort of result. So it's not inserted immediately at the time that I call that insert word method. It will be inserted at a later time when the async task actually runs. Okay, so that should be enough to fix your code and make it compile. Okay, So I can run this here. Maybe I try to add foo, hit save, and it did successfully add it. Oh, and that toast is being shown from here. So we'll see it showed up on the list, and that's because live data is, again, kind of making that change. We're observing for the change to live data. Let's say I add foo again. We'll see that it's not telling us anything about the error. It isn't crashing, which is good, but it's not telling us anything about maybe that it failed to insert that word, right? So what we have achieved is we have achieved a point where this activity now has no idea where the data is stored. It only knows about this repository, and it also doesn't need to do anything with background threads. Even though there is background threads involved, those are now dealt with by room and the repository. Okay. Any questions? I hope you can see where that repository abstraction is useful. So I do have, we use the member variable app we brought into the repository. If we needed it for other things, I think if you look at some of the other applications that we built previously, we did use that for a few different things, from looking at the settings to dealing with preferences and working with, for instance, the one we had with the hands-on test, we used that to get access to, for instance, I think what the current data was and such. I think there were a few things that we used that for. So in this specific case, you could just save this to a local variable, because that's all we're using it for, is just this one line. But in most applications, you'll find that you end up using that application object more than just that once. That's the only reason I saved it. So Dalton, if yours is not saving when we reopen it, what you'll want to do is go to the Word database class. You probably still have these methods, this callback, as being on open instead of being on create. So because if it's on open, it's going to delete the words and insert these new words every time you close the app and restart. So if you change that over to on create, that should solve your problem. Okay. So I do have a question for everybody here. We have extracted those things. We have extracted the background threads. We've extracted those things over to the repository. But one of the things I've lost is any sort of way to show errors to the user. So what are your thoughts about, well, what can I do to then show that error to the user if it fails to, for instance, insert? what could I do? Where are you thinking I would add a try-catch-gram? Well, the problem with that, I can't add it to, if I look at what's happening in onActivity result. So M repository insert word, okay. This never actually throws, insert word, this method will never actually throw an exception. Or it won't throw this exception that I'm interested in. Because if I look at what's happening in the repository, I'm offloading that to this insert word task. So that exception will never be thrown here. Okay. So I can't really add a try-catch either here or in main activity that would catch that exception because it's happening here in the do in background. Neither of those places is really capable of catching the exception because it doesn't happen at that time that code runs. It happens at a later time. With the insert word task, what I had previously done with moving it to on post execute worked in the sense that I had a reference. In on post execute, I did have a reference to the activity. So I could show that I could show that word on the activity. But because I no longer have any sort of reference to activities, I don't have an activity context. And realistically, the repository shouldn't have an activity context. So that solution that I used previously doesn't actually work here of trying to return an async task result because I still don't have a reference to an activity. So one of the tools that I could potentially use is one that we've covered previously. You remember earlier in the semester, just a few chapters ago, we talked about something called a local broadcast manager. And remember that we can use broadcasts and the local broadcasts in specific to send out messages to other parts of the application. So what I can do is I can say, let's use a broadcast. Let's send out a broadcast in the catch here, and then we will handle or receive that broadcast back in main activity. So rather than having the repository have any sort of connection to, rather than having it, rather than connecting the repository to the activity, we're just going to keep them disconnected. We're going to send that message through a local broadcast, is the way I would solve this. So this is not necessarily the only way to solve it, but it does it does a good job of using one of the tools we've already learned about and passing things through. So I'm going to add a dependency into here. So up top under implementation, I'm going to add the dependency for the local broadcast manager, which is that one. And I've linked that in the YouTube chat. So I'm going to add a dependency to the local broadcast manager. I'm going to hit sync. Again, if you don't see that button, you can click sync up here. It looks like an elephant. Okay, so now we have the dependency to the local broadcast manager. I can start hooking that up in the repository. So going back to Word repository, I'm going to add a reference to the local broadcast manager. So private local broadcast manager. Okay. Inside here, and broadcast manager is equal to, check, just remind me of where I get that. So local broadcast manager dot get instance. It needs a context, which in this case, I can use the application for that. Because that works with an application context. It doesn't have to be an activity context. And then I want to, well, that's all I need here. So I pass in the application object to get the broadcast manager. Okay, so now that I have the broadcast manager, I can use it down here to send a broadcast about the error. Before I do that, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I do need a few things. I need to be able to build an intent. So I need to define some constants for that. So public static final string. And this is going to be the this is going to be action error. So I want to use the name of my project. It's the beginning and dot error. So public static final error. Okay. So that's that, and then I also need to add a constant for the extra that I'm going to pass with that intent. For public static final string extra message is equal to message. Okay, so I'm going to send a broadcast with this action and an extra that includes the message. So that way I can display it in the main activity when I respond to this broadcast. Okay. So those are the constants I need, the action and the extra. And go back down, and then we can start sending that broadcast. So I need an intent. This is going to be my broadcast intent is equal to new intent. We're going to pass in action error. And I need to add my extra to there, broadcast intent. I'm going to put extra message, and in here I want to put ex.get message. And then we can actually send that intent. So mbroadcastManager dot send broadcast, and we're going to send the broadcast intent. Okay, cool. So that hooks it up to just pass in the one part that we need, which is just the message that's going to be displayed. Now we can come back to this and make this a little bit more user-friendly, because I'm just passing the message that's in the error. So I can make that look a little bit more friendly. I'll come back to that in a minute. So that's the start here. Okay, so we send that broadcast out from the Word repository, and then we're going to listen to that broadcast back in the main activity. So the main activity is actually going to do the job of displaying the toast. Okay, so back in main activity, let's go back up top. I need to have a reference to the local broadcast manager here as well. So private local broadcast manager, broadcast manager. Okay, and broadcast manager. Go into here, and broadcast manager is equal to local broadcast manager dot get instance. Pass in this. Okay, and I need a receiver that's going to respond to that broadcast. So private broadcast receiver, receiver is equal to new broadcast receiver, implement the onReceive method. So I'm going to say if, let's pull out the action. So string action is equal to intent dot get action. Okay, if that's the action I'm listening for, namely if Word repository dot action error equals action. Okay, so if this is that error action, then I need to extract the message extra from the intent. So intent dot get string extra, and that would be Word repository dot extra message. Okay, so grab those things, the action, the error, and then I can display the toast. So display toast message. Okay, so when this receiver receives that action, it will extract the message extra and then display that in a toast. Okay, so regardless of what part of the code sends out that local broadcast, the error local broadcast, it's then going to be shown to the UI, which means that that error broadcast actually can now be sent from anywhere in the application. I could, if I need to display an error, I could send that from the job service, from a service in the background, or I could set it from Word repository. It really doesn't know where that broadcast came from. And that will keep our activity context completely separated from everything else is out there. That also means that I'm not going to be showing error toasts when the user actually isn't using my application. They're only going to happen as the user is using the application. So I've got that receiver object. I need to register it. I'm going to register it in onStart. onStart. I need an intent filter. Equals new intent filter. And I'm interested in hearing at the moment the only action that's going out is that error action. So word repository dot action error. So add that action to the filter and then register the receiver. So m broadcast receiver dot register receiver m receiver, and then when the application oh, I need to pass in the intent filter. I missed that. Okay, so it's now interested. As soon as the main activity starts, we'll start listening for those broadcasts, and then when the activity stops, we'll stop listening. So we'll unregister that receiver. Okay, so test is added. Let's try to add test again. Hit save. And there I now have that error message. So that's displaying it in a toast. Now, one thing you might notice in there is that the error message is not very user-friendly. If you remember what we did with the async task over here, we looked at what kind of error it was, and we showed a different message according to that. So I'm going to do the same kind of thing, listening for SQLite constraint exception, but I'm going to do that back in the word repository. So in the word repository, I could do this one of two ways. I could say, well, let's only catch SQL constraint exceptions. We'll deal with them one way, or I'll deal with all the other exceptions one way. I'm going to do it in here, just using an if. So if EX is an instance of SQL constraint exception, which means it's that constraint violation, which is what we get when the word already exists, then we'll display one message, otherwise we'll display a different message. So if I look at what I had here previously, I said word already in database in this case, and I said fail to insert word in the other case. So I might clean that up a little bit. So basically I'm saying put one message in if if it's a SQL constraint exception, and then put a different message in if it's any other kind of exception. So that should lead it to be much more user-friendly. So word, let's see, I want to add in test because I've already added test. There we go. So it says word already in database. So local broadcast managers are still a useful tool, even with all this new stuff. There's still things that local broadcast managers are still good at, even given that we have this live data vModel stuff. I mean, it can kind of look like, well, maybe forget about all the other tools that you had previously. Well, don't forget about them because they're still useful in certain cases. It just kind of, you have to know what the right case to use the live data or vModel is over some of the other tools that we've already learned. Any questions? So we've worked our way through tasks 4 and 6. So the next one to get to is going to be task 7, where we integrate the view model. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to task 7 here and kind of see that that lives here between the repository and the UI controller. Okay, and the point of the view model is that it's meant to survive the configuration changes. That's the big part of it. It's meant to mean that we don't necessarily have to recreate all of the data when there's a configuration change, as well as potentially being able to share that data between different fragments, different activities, using it kind of as a communication point. So that kind of lives on top of the repository that we've just created. So we need to create that view model class. Now, that view model class is going to be a subclass of Android view model. Okay. So I'm going to create the Word view model class in here. New Java class Word view model. Now we are starting to get an awful lot of classes here in our application. So don't let me forget when we finish this and when we get to the end of the tasks to also talk about how I might split this up into separate packages or folders, so that's not all kind of in one place. We want to talk about how to maybe group some of these files together, so it's at least a little bit more orderly. Okay. So we've got our Word view model class. Oh yeah, this is a good time to take a break. Because we're a little bit over an hour in. Let's take a break and come back at maybe 2:15. Yeah, call it 2:15. So come back at 2:15 and we'll finish up the work with the view model, which is task 7 and 11. Okay, we'll just do it all. At least what's reasonable.
Well, I didn't clean the things I stuck in the freezer.
That's fine.
It's challenging because of the whole thing.
Yeah. I'm not saying anything yet. I had my mic muted though. All right. So let's see. Okay, so we've got a few people back, but not everybody yet. So it could be another minute or so. Cool. All right. So far, we have looked at adding the live data, using the live data to keep the UI up to date. We've added in an application class. We've used that to ensure that there's only one database object as well as only one repository. We've created that repository object and moved all of the kind of background thread work. We've moved a lot of that work out of the main activity, so the main activity is really just dealing with the UI. The next part that we want to add is this view model object. This view model object is not going to have very much code in it because basically all the logic's been moved into the repository, so it's just kind of a thin layer between the UI and the repository. Okay, so in here, this is kind of task 7, and then we'll come back in task 11 and we'll hook this view model to the UI. Okay. So task 7, we're going to create this view model object. I've called it Word View Model. And this needs to extend Android view model. Okay. You can optionally create view models that just extend view model, depending on what your needs are. And you can create other ways of creating view models. But by adding the Android view model, we'll get a reference to the application object, which will allow us to set up those connections with the repository. So in here, I'm going to add a variable for the repository, private word repository repository. I might want to add a reference to the application as well. And also I want a reference to the live data object. So live data list of word. This is going to be M all words. Okay, so that's the basic start there. I now need to add a constructor. So public word view model. And now because this is a subclass of Android view model, this needs to take an application object, or it will take an application object. Now, because we're not constructing the view model object directly, we can't say that this is a subclass. We can't specify word app here. It has to be specifically the generic application class. I do need to call the super constructor and pass in that application object. But when I then save repository, I need spelling. There, repository. Okay. I need to cast the application object to save it here. So mapp is equal to cast it to a word app, because I know that it will be, even though I can't receive it as such. And then I can get the repository from the application. Mapp.get repository. Okay, so that gives me a reference to the repository, and then I can get all the word data. So m all words is equal to m repository dot get all words. Okay, so that's my constructor. Is this the only way to set it up? Not really. The reason I'm setting it up this way rather than the way that the book, at least the way the lab has it, is because I want that repository to really be owned by the application, and I really only want one copy of that repository object. If I had done it the other way, then I could potentially have several repository objects floating around. So here is that. I now need some getters. So public live data get all words. So get all words is just going to return all words, and I need a method to insert a word. So public void insert word. And here I'm going to say repository dot insert word. I do need to take in a word as a parameter. There we go. Okay, so the repository, the view model effectively has really just two methods. You can get all the words, get all the word data, and you can insert a new word. If I needed to add additional operations, like for instance to be able to delete or update words, I'd also need to add those in here, and those would likely refer back down to the repository. Okay, so that is my view model. Okay, so that puts us at the end of task 7. Any questions about that class? So going to task 11, yeah, there should be a lot of commonality that you see between this view model and the repository. So in the main activity, we now need a reference to this word view model, which is going to be task 11. So I'm going to go back to main activity. We have a reference currently to the repository, and we have a reference to the application. We actually won't need either of those in a minute, so I'm going to actually remove both of those per se. Again, I might still want the application object. I might use it for something, but with the way that we're going to change things, I won't even need a reference to it in the activity now. So I'm going to add a variable here, word view model, which is going to contain that view model. So word view model and word view model. So that's going to replace both the reference to the app and the reference to the repository. So here I just have the word view model. Going back in here, I'm going to remove both of those. I'm going to comment out both of those lines, and instead I'm going to need to get the word view model first. So the word view model has kind of a longer way to kind of get to it. So in order to get to the view model, and this part of the code is what manages kind of keeping the same view model from when the device goes through configuration changes, specifically if it goes through rotation, it will be able to reconnect to the previous view model. This was really what allows that to happen. So in here, I'm going to call into view model provider, missing something. View model, maybe. I must be missing something. So something must have changed from here. So this used to be the way to get there. One thing must have changed with that for Android, for the Jetpack library. So what's changed there for Jetpack? Model providers. Okay. Use this class is deprecated. Use view model provider constructor directly. Okay. So that's the gist of what I need to do. So new view model provider. What do I need to pass into there? I need to pass in the owner, which the owner should be this. And what else does the constructor need? Okay, dot the get, and it needs to be word view model dot class. So if you're using the Jetpack dependency, that's moved. So it used to be view model providers of get. It's now a new view model provider get. If this still worked for you, there's a good chance that your dependencies are wrong, and maybe you're depending on the old Jetpack the old architecture dependencies rather than the new ones, the new lifecycle dependencies. So you may want to go back and check your dependencies. If you've updated them to the latest, I'll paste that into Discord. Those are the latest ones for the lifecycle components. Okay, so create a new view model provider, and then I want to get specifically an instance of the word view model. Okay. Now that I've got that view model, I'm just going to get all the words from the view model itself. So basically what changes there is we're using this view model as kind of a go-between between the repository and the activity. Okay, so I made those two changes here. I need to then go back to, I need to go down to the place where we're inserting, and then rather than using the repository, I'm going to use that word view model to insert it. Okay, so let's do a test on that to make sure that that's all good. Okay, what am I seeing? Okay, so it's crashing. Logcat, let's see what I'm missing. Core compatibility. Okay, find class. Didn't find class. File not found. Delete. Clear that and run again. Okay, so let's see what we have here. So on main activity line 66, it's not terribly happy. Can it create instance of word view model? Okay. Unable to start activity component info. So class word view model. Okay. So why cannot create an instance of that? Taking an application object. Let me comment out those lines and see what happens. Review model has... Oh, okay, so it is expecting... So it's expecting that to not take any sort of... It's expecting that not to take any sort of argument. Well, that's interesting. So what has changed? Clearly something's changed with how I need to set up this view model since originally the code lab was written. Okay, so let's do some diagnosis. So this used to work pre-Jetpack. We know that much. So the question is going to be, what changed post-Jetpack? So I do know, I was looking up this earlier before class started. So I do know, at least there's a video that we can watch that might point us in the right direction. Because clearly something on this front has changed. So pull that up, and my... All right, so this is in the playlist for the course.
To the screen and the...
So for future reference, if you're looking for this video, that's the path to it.
The architecture components lifecycle library.
I'm going to go ahead and pull this in here so we can take a look at what this is. So this is an updated video about how to deal with the view model in Jetpack. Actually, I'm looking at the wrong one. This is...
Weird UI bugs or even crashes.
Yeah, I'm looking at the wrong one. That was the old one. This is the new one. So here's the new, there's the new link to it. So they did one video about how view model used to work. There's another video, just a 5-minute video about how it works now. And that maybe will enlighten us about some of the things that have changed. So let's pull that up.
At Google I/O 2017, we announced the Lifecycle Library. The Lifecycle Library is a set of libraries and guidance for avoiding memory leaks and solving common Android lifecycle challenges. Now the Lifecycle Library has hit 2.0, it's part of Jetpack, and it includes new integrations with data binding. This is a tour of the Lifecycle Library's view model class. A view model holds your app's UI data while surviving configuration changes. Here's why that's actually useful. Rotating your phone is considered a configuration change. Configuration changes cause your whole activity to get torn down and then recreated. If you don't properly save and restore data from the destroyed activity, you may lose that data and end up with weird UI bugs or even crashes. So enter the view model, which of course survives configuration changes. Instead of storing all of your UI data in your activity, put it in the view model instead. Now this helps with configuration changes, but it's also just general good software design. One common pitfall when developing for Android is putting a lot of variables, logic, and data into your activities and fragments. This creates a large, unmaintainable mess of a class and violates the single responsibility principle. You can use view models to easily divide out that responsibility. The view models will be responsible for holding all of the data that you're going to show in your UI, and then the activity is only responsible for knowing how to draw that data to the screen and receiving user interactions, but not for processing them. If your app loads and stores data, I suggest making a repository class as described in the Guide to App Architecture. Make sure your view model doesn't become bloated with too many responsibilities. To avoid this, you can create a presenter class or implement a more fully fledged clean architecture. Okay, so to make a view model, you'll end up extending the view model class, and then you put your UI-related instance variables that were previously in your activity into your view model. Then in your activities onCreate, you get the view model from a framework utility class called View Model Provider.
So one thing I might mention on the code that you're seeing on screen, it might look a little bit foreign. The reason that is, I guess this tutorial is going through Kotlin, doing this in Kotlin rather than doing this in Java. So Kotlin is another language that can generate the same bytecode as Java, and is seeing at least some traction in Android development. You can see it's a little bit, there are some similarities between how Java works, but it's quite a bit of a different syntax. It's maybe a little bit of a cross between, say, Java and JavaScript. But that's what you're seeing here. That's why things look different, is because this is Kotlin and Java.
Notice that View Model Provider takes an activity instance. This is the mechanism that allows you to rotate the device, get a technically new activity instance, but always ensure that that activity instance is associated with the same view model. With the view model instance, you can use getters and setters to access UI data from your activity. If you want to modify the default constructor, which currently takes no parameters, you could use a view model factory to create a custom constructor. Now this is the simplest use case of a view model, but the view model class is also designed to work well with live data and data binding. Using all of these together, you can create a reactive UI, which is just a fancy way of saying a UI that automatically updates whenever the underlying data changes. This assumes all of your data in your view model that you plan to show on screen is wrapped in live data. You then should set up data binding as normal. Here's an example XML with the data binding layout tag and the variable tag for your view model. Then, in your activity or fragment, you associate the variables used in the XML with the binding. Here's an example with an activity. There's one new line of code, set lifecycle owner. This allows the binding to observe your live data objects in the view model, and it's essentially the magic that lets the binding update whenever the live data updates and the view model is on screen. You can now directly reference live data fields from your view model in your XML. If you combine this with binding adapters, you can move much of the boilerplate logic out of your activity. Note that this became available in Android Studio 3.1 and higher, so make sure you're on the correct version. To learn more, check out the Introduction to Live Data and the docs. Okay, I'm going to finish off with a few best practices. First tip, you should never pass contexts into view models. This means no passing in fragments, activities, or views. As you saw earlier, view models can outlive your specific activity and fragment lifecycles. Let's say that you store an activity in your view model. When you rotate the screen, that activity is destroyed. You now have a view model holding a reference to a destroyed activity, and this is a memory leak. So if you find yourself needing application contexts, which outlive view model lifecycles, use the Android view model subclass instead. This includes a reference to the application for you to use. Okay, second tip. View models are meant to be used in addition to on-saved instance state. View models do not survive process shutdown due to resource restrictions, but on-saved instance bundles do. View models are great for storing huge amounts of data. On-saved instance state bundles, not so much. Use view models to store as much UI data as possible so that that data doesn't need to be reloaded or regenerated during a configuration change. On-saved instance state, on the other hand, should store the smallest amount of data needed to restore the UI state if the process is shut down by the framework. So for example, you might store all of the user's data within the view model, but just store the user's database ID in on-saved instance state. Hopefully, this has inspired you to try out the new view model class in your apps, either by itself or with the other architecture components. To learn more about using view models or any of the information that I just mentioned, check out the documentation below.
Okay, So doing a little bit of research, it looks like that hasn't, at least that part hasn't changed. So maybe if I move a few things around. So testing this real quick. Try again. So I'm going to go back. Oh, that's why. Okay, let's see if I can get this. Try again. Back to here. Let's see if that solves the problem. Okay, so that solves the problem. So I do want to go back to view model providers of this as it shows here. The catch is I need to add an additional dependency, which is this dependency here. So I'm going to remove that, kind of walk back to where we were. So the way that I got here, so I tried to put in view model providers of this as it shows kind of in the lab. But you'll see that it's red and it doesn't show up. If I hit Alt-Enter, there's not really an option to just say import it. What there is an option in the dropdown to do is add a dependency. So we need to add a dependency on android.lifecycle.lifecycle extensions. So we need an additional dependency is what we're missing. So if I click add dependency on lifecycle extensions, it's going to go ahead and add that. Now it's going to work here. You may have to hit Alt-Enter and integrate that dependency. You will see that it's crossed out because it's basically deprecated at this moment. But that's what we need to add there. Now, looking real briefly at the build Gradle, the module for the module, we will have added this dependency here. One of the things you'll notice is it's just hard-coded the numbers 220 as such. Really, we want to keep that in sync with our lifecycle version. So similar to how these all end with that $sign lifecycle version, I'll want to go change that to be a lifecycle version there as well. So that should bring in the appropriate dependency that I need. What did I miss? Oh, I pasted over too much. Did I? Or did I not? Oh, I need to be using double quotes in order for it to evaluate that version number. So single quotes it doesn't evaluate that, double quotes it does. So that's what I need there, is the double quotes to evaluate that variable. So adding that dependency and then running the code as is does appear to work. It's just we're missing that. We were missing that additional dependency. Sorry about that. That's one of those things I try to catch before we have lecture, and it must have been something that definitely something that slipped my testing. Okay. I think that's it as far as the view model is concerned. Any questions there about that? My onActivity result method. The big change here was I was referring to the only change I made is the change it from referring to the repository to change it to refer to the view model. So to kind of rehash, review what we've done today, we added in the live data. Remember that live data we added originally in the DAO, and then as we've gone through, we've kind of trickled it down from there. We added in an application class to make it such that there only is one database object and there only is one repository. Both of those things are owned by the application. We added in a repository object, which is really managing the background work, the background logic of storing and retrieving data from different data sources. And then we added a view model, which is connecting, kind of interfacing between the front end and that back end, which is the repository. Okay. You say yours is crashing, Dalton. My guess is probably going to be that you need to change this line 67 back to kind of what it is here. Okay. So I think that's everything in the 10.1a lab as far as the tasks are concerned, because what we just finished was task 11. We already did task 12. Yes, you'll still have a line through it. This is still deprecated because there is a change that they're recommending. They're warning you that they've deprecated this class is the gist of it. But at least trying to switch, a cursory trying to switch over to the new thing didn't work for me. So I'll have to do some more research to see what the new pathway is. Because it looks like it's changed at least twice, basically, since this tutorial was written. So, but I think that should give you enough to kind of understand what's going on, understand some of the newer conventions. I think you should be able to get through 10.1b now, given all that. There's no coding challenge with this lab here, so. As I mentioned earlier before we finish this off, I did want to talk about what folders maybe moving the folder structure around a bit. So now may be a good time to talk about doing that. Yeah, so you'll do Part B yourselves. The way to get that, if you go back to the list of activities. So we just finished 10.1a. There's a 10.1b, and that's going to add functionality to delete data through the app. Obviously, you'll have to adapt that to the things that have changed in Jetpack and the way things are structured a little bit differently, but I don't think that that should be too hard. I think I'll follow up with you individually, Dalton, about what your issue is. So Part A does not have a coding challenge at all to go with it. Part A does have a homework question, but I'm not going to ask you to do the homework question on it. It's kind of fairly vague. If you want to try and build it, you can, but I think you're better off. I'd rather have you invest that time in your final project than this particular homework project. Let's look at 10.1b. I can't remember if 10.1b has a coding challenge to go with it. 10.1b has a coding challenge. And what does it say? Update your app to allow users to edit a word by tapping the word and then saving their changes. That might be a good thing to go through. Yes, probably the coding challenge for 10.1b. But the homework... Yeah, so skip the homework for both 10.1a and 10.1b, but do the coding challenge for 10.1b, which will have you implement update functionality. Let's make sure I have that updated on Inside Rankin. Let's see what I've got on Inside Rankin. 10.1. I broke up the tasks. Homework. There we go. Okay. So yeah, Friday should be a lab day. The rest of today is obviously a lab day, and then hopefully tomorrow, going through the hands-on test example shouldn't take all of the session. Okay, so I'm going to shut the stream down. Oh, wait, no. Before I shut the stream down, I still need to cover that piece. I keep forgetting about that. Okay, so the folders in Android Studio. We've got a lot of classes. We probably don't want to have all of our classes be in just one folder. Okay. So what we want to do there is underneath our project here, I'm going to create a few folders for different things. So if we kind of think about what we have here, we've got the back end and we've got kind of the front end as well. So I could split that into, for instance, maybe I say here is our back end or our database. I'm going to call it, maybe we call this one DB. Add, oh, no, I don't want a new class. Delete. I want a folder. So maybe I add a folder. There it is. I want to add a package called DB. And maybe I add a package called UI. So new package UI. Okay. So I kind of can split a lot of these classes up based on are they front end or are they the back end. So in terms of sorting things out, I know that I can, my word class is basically part of my DB. I'm going to move it and hit refactor. Go ahead and do refactor. I know that my async task result is probably also back end. I'll come back to that in a minute. I know my main activity is probably front end. So I want to say let's make a few folders in the UI. So UI activity. So I'm going to create a UI activity package, a UI fragment package, and a UI adapter package. All right, and then let's move some of these things around. So I also want view models. So here I'm going to make another package, call it view model. Okay, so on the back end, I've got entities. So new package entity on the database side. On the back end, I also have DAOs. And then I have a few other classes. So let's move Word into the entity folder. Do refactor. Yes. Let's move Word DAO into that DB DAO folder. I'm going to move async task into the DB folder. I'm going to move main activity into UI main activity. I'm going to move new Word activity into here as well. Word app. Maybe I make that part of the maybe the back end, and maybe it's better if I call that back end and not. Yeah, let's, rather than naming that DB, why don't I call that data? To be more general. Okay, do refactor. So I've got UI and data. I've got the Word database is going to go into data. Yep, do refactor. My word list adapter is going to go into here. My Word repository is going to go into data as well. And my Word view model is going to go in here. So that's how I'm going to structure my packages. I'm going to go ahead and take a snip of this structure and post it into Discord. So that at least should give you some idea of where to put things, so that it's not all in one place. Any questions on that structure? Second draft of your project proposal is still due tomorrow. Remember, it's still a draft, so it's not maybe the final version of it, but I need to see kind of where everybody's going with headed with their final projects at this point. So if you have any questions about the final project, please contact me on Discord, so we can kind of review what you have and talk about feasibility and what kind of tables, your schema for your database, things like that. I'm gonna shut this down here because I think we've done everything we need to do with this example, and then I'll be on Discord for any further questions.